The story begins with Mrs. Ruth, an elderly mother, feeling that she is gradually being forgotten and pushed aside in her own home. Throughout her life, she has dedicated all her love, time, and effort to raising her children, but now she feels as if she is no longer important. Her daughter, Grace, is now married and has her own life. One day, Grace suggests that Mrs. Ruth move in with her family, something Mrs. Ruth perceives as an act of care and filial piety. But over time, she realizes that it is not the selfless care she had imagined. Grace and her husband, Peter, welcome Mrs. Ruth into their home with kind words, but what she feels is entirely different. At first, Mrs. Ruth feels comforted, but after a short while, tensions begin to arise. Despite her efforts to fit in and not disturb her daughter's life, the cold stares from Peter and the indifferent attitude from Grace make her feel that she is no longer a significant part of this family. Ruth, once a strong woman, finds the small changes in her daughter's behavior making her feel like a burden. The family meals, which used to be filled with lively conversation, are now silent. Peter, Grace's husband, seems to grow more distant and harder to approach. He speaks little, and whenever Mrs. Ruth tries to start a conversation, his responses are brief and cold. Grace is no longer the daughter Mrs. Ruth once admired for her filial piety. Grace's hurried departures for work, or her focus on her job and social relationships, make Mrs. Ruth feel like she is just a superfluous part of her life. Even though she tries not to show her discomfort, the loneliness inside her continues to burn. One evening, Mrs. Ruth happens to overhear a conversation between Grace and Peter. They were talking about her, not realizing she could hear. "Mom is like a ghost in the house," Peter says. "I don't know how we can keep doing this." Grace remains silent, but her expression shows agreement with her husband. Those words struck Mrs. Ruth like a slap to the heart. She never imagined that the daughter she had spent her whole life nurturing would now see her as a burden. Her emotions surged, but she didn't know what to say. She could only sit in the living room, gazing out the window, lost in thought. As the days passed, the relationship between Mrs. Ruth and Grace's family grew increasingly strained. Simple questions from Mrs. Ruth, like, "Do you need help?" or "Are you okay?" became annoyances. She realized that her daughter no longer wanted to share or talk with her. Their relationship was no longer what it used to be, when she was the one Grace could turn to at any moment. Instead, she felt like an unwanted guest, living in her daughter's house, but with no place in it. For Mrs. Ruth, this loneliness was something new. For years, she had been used to nurturing her family, always being the one who supported and cared for her children. Now, as age and declining health caught up with her, she couldn't accept becoming a burden to those she loved. One morning, as she prepared breakfast for the family, she felt a strange sense of frustration. Grace and Peter seemed to have no interest in her anymore. They hadn't asked if she needed help, and she didn't know what to do to feel like she wasn't being pushed aside. Standing in the kitchen, she suddenly recalled the old days when she cared for her children with all her love, and she felt the pain slowly seep into her soul. Her life no longer seemed as meaningful as it once had. In the end, Mrs. Ruth decided she couldn't continue living like this. Although she didn't want to disturb Grace or Peter, she couldn't live in such loneliness and abandonment any longer. She began thinking about leaving, even though it was difficult and painful. Day by day, Mrs. Ruth began to feel the noticeable change in her relationship with Grace and Peter. At first, she thought it was just a difficult phase, that everything would return to normal once things settled down. But no, everything only got worse. The conversations between Peter and Grace were no longer the lively and constructive discussions they once were. Now they felt like distant exchanges, devoid of care and love. One evening, as Mrs. Ruth sat in the living room, occasionally hearing laughter from the kitchen, she knew that Grace and Peter were talking to each other. She didn't dare to interrupt them, as she had noticed their impatience in their gazes when she tried to join the conversation. Instead, she sat alone, listening to them discuss their personal plans, and she began to feel like an outsider. One evening, while Mrs. Ruth was tidying up the living room, she accidentally overheard a conversation that made her heart feel like it was being squeezed. Peter, sitting on the sofa, said to Grace, "Mom seems to be getting more difficult and bothersome. I don't understand why she always tries to involve herself in everything. She's no longer the mother you used to have. I think we should let her take care of herself, without interfering too much." Peter's words struck Mrs. Ruth like a powerful shock. The daughter she had spent her entire life caring for and loving was now siding with her husband without defending her. She felt an emptiness inside, not only because of Peter's indifference, but also because of Grace, the daughter she had trusted to understand and care for her in her later years. She couldn't believe those words had come from the daughter she had nurtured, taught, and loved unconditionally. After hearing that conversation, Mrs. Ruth decided that she would no longer intervene. She felt that her presence was no longer welcome in this house. The feelings of loneliness and abandonment began to spread within her. Each day, she lived in silence, quietly doing small chores that no one in the family paid attention to. The meals were no longer joyful, the conversations no longer intimate, and the relationship between her and her daughter slowly drifted apart. Grace, though not expressing it outright, showed a clear change in her attitude, which Mrs. Ruth could feel. Before, when Mrs. Ruth needed help or just a bit of sharing, Grace would always be there to listen and help. But now, she always avoided conversations with her, and simple questions like, "Do you need help?" were met with short and indifferent answers. Every time Mrs. Ruth tried to join family activities, from meals to outings, she was left out. The feeling of being an unnecessary part of this family made her feel sad and humiliated. There were times when Mrs. Ruth sat alone, looking out the window and thinking about the old days, when the family was gathered together, everything was warm and full of love. She remembered the days when every time she visited Grace, the whole family warmly welcomed her, and they shared happy moments together. But now everything felt like a distant dream. And the truth was that she was just an outsider in the house, where she should have felt safe and loved. One weekend, she decided to try talking to Grace about her feelings. She wanted her daughter to know that she couldn't continue living in this silence and loneliness. However, when she opened her mouth, she felt the words choke in her throat. No matter what she said, she knew that the changes had been too great to ever return to how things were. Grace, with a blank expression, just listened and then said, "Mom, we're all busy with our own lives. I don't want you to feel like a burden, but honestly, we can't spend too much time with you right now." Those words felt like a deep cut to Mrs. Ruth's heart. The feeling of rejection and abandonment surged within her, and this time, she couldn't hold back the tears. She couldn't understand why her daughter would treat her this way after she had spent her entire life caring for and loving her. In the days that followed, Mrs. Ruth was left with nothing but silence in that house. Her relationship with Grace seemed irreparable, and the sense of abandonment grew more and more evident. Every morning when she woke up, she no longer looked forward to warm conversations or joyful moments with the family. Everything had become cold, and all she had left was an emptiness that couldn't be filled. That day, Mrs. Ruth never expected that a simple conversation could change her life forever. As she sat down, preparing for a simple meal that her daughter Grace had prepared, she had no idea that this would be the last time she would sit with Grace and Peter for a family meal. Everything had changed, and she couldn't see it coming until it was too late. That evening, after the meal was finished and everyone sat back in the living room, Grace and Peter were no longer the companions, the loved ones that she had relied on for so many years. They sat there, not speaking, their eyes meeting in silence, as if searching for the right words to say. Meanwhile, Mrs. Ruth could feel the discomfort in the air, a choking sensation she couldn't put into words. Everything had become distant, no longer connected, only empty spaces between each person. Finally, Peter spoke up, his voice hesitant yet determined. "Mom, we need to talk." Mrs. Ruth didn't understand, but the heaviness in her heart gave her a bad feeling. Peter continued, "We think it's time for you to find a place of your own. You've been busy with work and your own family, and we feel that you need to take care of yourself." Those words felt like knives cutting into her heart. The feeling of being pushed out, removed from her children's lives, was something she had never imagined. She had lived her whole life for her family, sacrificing for her children, raising them, caring for them, and loving them unconditionally. And now all she received in return was coldness and a request to leave. There was no understanding, no love, only the indifference from the people she had always considered family. Mrs. Ruth couldn't say anything. Her throat tightened, unable to form any words. Tears she could no longer hold back began to fall, but she tried to stay calm, not wanting Grace and Peter to see her weakness. She didn't want them to know how deeply this rejection had hurt her. She had hoped to find comfort from them, but now she felt like a stranger in her own home. Grace, seeing her mother remain silent, simply looked down, not offering any empathy, not a word of consolation. She just nodded gently and said, "Mom, I think this is the best decision for the whole family. I don't want you to feel like a burden, but we just can't continue living this way." These words struck Mrs. Ruth like a hammer, leaving her dazed and unable to understand how her daughter could say such things. After the conversation ended, Mrs. Ruth went upstairs to her room without saying another word. She closed the door, sat on the single bed, and began to think about everything that had happened. She couldn't understand why her daughter and son-in-law treated her this way. After all the years of care, after all the nights she stayed up late taking care of her children, now all she received in return was alienation. But perhaps, she realized, she couldn't force her daughter to empathize. The feelings of abandonment and loneliness became more and more palpable within her. Though her heart was filled with pain, Mrs. Ruth understood that perhaps this was the moment she needed to change. Not because she didn't love Grace, but because she needed to protect herself. If she stayed and continued living in a family where she no longer felt cared for or loved, she would only continue to be hurt. She didn't want to be a burden to her children, didn't want to be seen as useless in her own home. She decided that it was time to find a place of her own, so as not to disturb her daughter and to live with the respect and freedom she deserved. And so she began planning for a new life. She didn't know where she would go, but she knew she needed to find her own space, where she could take care of herself without carrying the sadness and hurt. She wouldn't let her life be governed by coldness and unfairness. She would leave, even though it was a painful decision, but it was the path she had to take to find peace within herself. When Mrs. Ruth moved out of her daughter's house, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of loneliness enveloping her. The new home she rented was small, simple, yet quite cozy. The walls were no longer witnesses to family memories, but empty spaces she had to fill with her own thoughts and emotions. For the first time in many years, she had to live alone, without anyone to talk to, no one to care for, and no one to share the joys and sorrows of life with. However, as soon as she stepped into the new space, she felt an unfamiliar tranquility. In the early days, she couldn't help but compare her current life to the one she had before. The feeling of emptiness was overwhelming, but then another strange feeling began to emerge: relief. There were no longer the impatient glances from Grace, no more evident annoyance in Peter's voice whenever she said something. Each passing day, she realized that she no longer had to live by the rules and pressures set by her family. In the mornings, she woke up without worrying about helping anyone, without having to prepare breakfast for the whole family. She could do things her way. The meals were simple yet nutritious, not for a family, but just for herself. She could sit by the window longer, sipping a cup of tea and watching the leaves outside sway in the wind. At times like that, she felt like she had returned to a different version of herself, a woman no longer weighed down by the responsibilities and burdens of family life. In the afternoons, she walked around the small neighborhood, chatted with the neighbors, or simply sat on the porch swing reading a book. Life was no longer rushed. She no longer had to worry about pleasing everyone around her. She no longer had to keep up the appearance of being cheerful and enthusiastic every time she met someone because she knew she had done enough, had given her all to her family. She could relax, living a life free from obligations. Though there was a newfound sense of freedom, loneliness was still inevitable. At night, the emptiness of the house made her feel the lack of affection. The small noises in the house, like the hum of the fan, the sound of the refrigerator, or the insects outside, only emphasized the silence of the space. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and wondered if she had been a failure as a mother, with no one left beside her to care for her, to share with her. She remembered the old days when she lived in Grace's house, where she was always the one asked to do everything, but it was also the place where she felt the closeness, her presence being acknowledged. Even though the conflicts had gradually torn the family apart, she couldn't deny that. At least back then, she wasn't alone. Now, facing the silence of this small house, she couldn't help but feel a profound sadness. But at the same time, she realized an important truth. This loneliness was not an end, but a beginning. Without the burden of worrying about others, she could focus on herself, on things she had never had time for. She could listen to the music she loved, not the songs Grace or Peter picked for the family. She could take a walk in the park without rushing home to prepare a meal. Small things like these, little by little, made her realize that life was no longer frightening, no longer completely empty as she had once thought. This loneliness, no matter how difficult, had taught her an important lesson. Sometimes we need to learn to live alone in order to rediscover ourselves. She was no longer a mother burdened with responsibilities, no longer a housewife in the family. She was a woman, an independent individual with the right to live for herself. Each day she gradually accepted this loneliness as a part of life, no longer feeling afraid. More importantly, she knew that she could still stand strong, still live a meaningful life, even without the presence of her children beside her. When Mrs. Ruth began her new life alone, she couldn't help but feel like she was stepping into a world that had long been forgotten. For many years, she had sacrificed most of her time and energy to care for her family, doing the mundane tasks without ever thinking about taking care of herself. But when loneliness became her companion, she realized that she had lost touch with the passions and hobbies that once brought joy to her life. In the early days of living in her new house, she didn't know where to begin. The peaceful life without the disruptions of family made it difficult for her to find a purpose for each day. But then, one morning, while cleaning the living room, her eyes unintentionally stopped at the yoga mat she had bought a long time ago, a thing she hadn't used since moving in with Grace. She didn't think she would start again, but that small mat was like a reminder of things she had once loved and always wanted to try, but had been forgotten in the busy life of being a mother and wife. It didn't take long for her to decide to lay the yoga mat on the floor. For the first time in many years, as she performed a yoga pose, she felt her body stiff and uncomfortable. But it was this very feeling that made her realize the changes within herself, the need to care for both her body and mind. Although her body was no longer as flexible as before, each gentle movement, each deep breath gradually brought her into a state of relaxation that she hadn't felt in a long time. Little by little, she began to enjoy yoga. It not only helped her body become more flexible, but also helped her find peace within her soul. Yoga became more than just a form of exercise for Mrs. Ruth. It became a method to relax and cleanse her mind after years of stress. In the early mornings, she woke up earlier than usual, laid out her mat, and began the day with simple yoga moves. Although she wasn't an expert, each time she finished a session, she felt closer to herself, to the person she had neglected throughout the years of taking care of her family. In addition to yoga, Mrs. Ruth decided to try her hand at gardening, a hobby she had loved since her youth, but had abandoned when her family became too busy. She started by planting a few pots of flowers in the small yard of her house. At first, they were just simple flowers, but gradually she added various plants like vegetables, herbs, and her favorite flowers. Gardening not only brought her joy as she watched the plants bloom, but also helped her feel a connection to nature, as if she had found a part of herself that she had lost. Every afternoon, Mrs. Ruth spent time tending to her garden, watching the flowers bloom, and picking the first fruits from the vegetables she had grown. The feeling of life sprouting from tiny seeds was magical. The busy days of taking care of the children and working in the kitchen were no longer her priority. Now she enjoyed every moment spent with the flowers and plants, sensing a change within herself. Moreover, Mrs. Ruth rediscovered her passion for art. When she was younger, she loved painting, but due to family and work, she had given up that hobby. After moving out on her own, she decided to pick up a pen and paper again, starting with simple paintings of the scenes in her garden. The paintings were not perfect, but full of emotion, and gradually, they became an essential part of her life. Every time she held the brush, she felt liberated from her tangled thoughts and found tranquility in expressing what she felt through each stroke. Painting, gardening, and practicing yoga helped Mrs. Ruth not only regain her physical health, but also rediscover a part of herself that she had lost. She was no longer the woman who only knew sacrifice and caring for her family. She was an independent person, able to live the life she had always dreamed of. These hobbies not only helped her overcome loneliness, but also brought her a gentle, simple happiness that was complete in its own way. Since that day, Mrs. Ruth was no longer the elderly mother who only knew how to give to her family. She had found her dreams again, the small but precious joys that she had forgotten. And through that, she realized that in order to love others, sometimes we need to learn how to love ourselves first. One morning, as Mrs. Ruth sat in the garden, enjoying the fresh air and the warm sunlight, her phone suddenly rang. It was Grace, her daughter. Her voice sounded tense, as if she was facing a serious problem. "Mom, I'm having trouble at work," Grace said, her voice filled with anxiety. "I don't know what to do. I feel like I'm about to lose my job, and I don't know how I'll manage." Hearing her daughter's voice, Mrs. Ruth couldn't help but feel a little pity. The daughter she had cared for all those years was now facing a significant challenge at work. She understood that difficulties in one's career were something everyone had to go through. But what troubled her more was how Grace always tried to avoid responsibility and expected help from others, especially from her. She recalled previous times when Grace had called asking for help, even though Mrs. Ruth had always tried to encourage her to stand on her own. Mrs. Ruth took a deep breath, placed the phone to her ear, and began speaking. "Grace, I understand you're having a tough time, but you have to remember that life can't always be as easy as we want it to be. I can't keep helping you forever. You need to stand up and solve your own problems." Grace fell silent for a moment, and then her weak voice replied, "Mom, I don't know what to do anymore. I really need your help." Mrs. Ruth listened quietly, but instead of rushing to offer advice, she remained silent for a long time, thinking about what had happened in her own life. She had once been a mother who cared for her children every moment, sacrificing everything for her family. But now, she realized she could not always bear the weight of everything for her children, especially when Grace had reached adulthood. It was time to let her figure things out and learn to stand on her own. "I can't solve all your problems, Grace," Mrs. Ruth said gently, but her words carried a firmness that was impossible to ignore. "You need to face this difficulty. Find a way to solve it on your own. I don't want you to live depending on others forever. This is the time for you to grow up." For the first time in her life, Mrs. Ruth didn't feel guilty about refusing to help her daughter. She didn't want to always be the one to rescue her. Instead, she wanted Grace to find a way to overcome the challenge herself. She remembered what had helped her become stronger when she faced difficulties in the past: the ability to get up, to overcome life's storms on her own. And she hoped that now, Grace would learn the same lesson. Mrs. Ruth didn't know what Grace would do after the call, but she felt a strong belief that her daughter could handle it. Sometimes, a mother has to know when to let go and give her child the chance to become independent. This didn't mean she no longer loved her. It was a way of showing love, a love that helps children grow. Grace stayed silent for a long time before replying, "Mom, I'll try. I know you're right, but I'm still very scared." "You will get through this," Mrs. Ruth said, her voice warm but firm. "I believe in you." After the call, Mrs. Ruth felt an unusual sense of peace. The daughter she loved had been given the opportunity to take control of her own life. She knew this was the right decision. Love isn't about sheltering and protecting forever. It's about helping children realize their own abilities and trusting in themselves. After placing the phone down, Mrs. Ruth returned to the garden and continued tending to the plants. The sense of freedom and relief grew clearer within her. Her life had changed, and the most important thing was that she had regained control and independence for herself. She no longer had to be the one to carry everything for someone else. and she was proud of the decision she had just made. Her daughter, even though she might face difficulties, would learn that life couldn't always rely on others. Everyone must take responsibility for themselves. After the tense conversation with her mother, Grace took some time to reflect and look back at herself. Although at first she felt sad and somewhat disappointed by her mother's refusal, over time, she began to realize that Mrs. Ruth had not given up on her, but had instead done the best thing for her. She understood that maturity doesn't come from always having someone to back you up, but from standing up and facing challenges on your own. A week later, Grace called her mother again. This time, her voice was completely different, no longer filled with weakness and worry, but with confidence and determination. "Mom, I found a new job," Grace said excitedly. "Not only that, but I also feel so much stronger. Thank you, Mom. Really thank you for making me look at myself." Mrs. Ruth sat in her room, listening to these words with a feeling she couldn't describe. Though she couldn't see her daughter, she could sense the pride in the way Grace spoke. Mrs. Ruth had not expected that her refusal to help would lead to such results. Her daughter, who had once always sought support from others, now stood strong and solved her own problems. "You did great, Grace," Mrs. Ruth replied, her voice gentle but full of pride. "I always knew you could do it, as long as you believe in yourself." Grace smiled through the phone, feeling her mother's warmth even though she wasn't nearby. "I really couldn't have done it without the strength you passed on to me. I feel like I've discovered a strength I didn't know I had. Thank you, Mom, for not always sheltering me and for letting me face the challenge on my own." After that call, Grace felt a profound change within herself. She began to realize that the difficulties and challenges in life weren't things to be avoided, but opportunities to learn and grow. She looked back at the previous days when everything seemed like a burden, but now, each challenge she overcame felt like a great victory, helping her become stronger and more independent. The new job Grace had gotten was a wonderful opportunity, not only financially, but also mentally. She worked in an environment where she could use her creativity and began to feel valued. Though the job wasn't always easy, Grace had learned how to face challenges and was no longer afraid like she used to be. She started to trust herself more, and that confidence came not only from her work, but from the progress she was making in her personal life as well. Day by day, Grace not only became more confident in her work, but also began to reconnect with the relationships around her. She had learned how to love and care for herself, no longer relying on her mother's help whenever things got tough. She learned how to solve problems, accept failure, and get back up after each fall. With this newfound confidence, Grace also began to rebuild her relationship with her mother. She realized that, although Mrs. Ruth had been distant for a while, that very distance helped her understand the importance of her mother in her life. Their relationship had changed, no longer one of mutual dependence, but one of respect and deeper love. Grace had learned that sometimes love isn't about always being there, but knowing when to let the other person stand on their own. She had discovered a strength within herself that she hadn't known before, and thanked her mother for helping her realize that. She no longer felt dependent on others. Instead, she was a confident, independent woman capable of facing life head-on. And it was because of this change that Grace felt she was truly living her own life. After months of tension and conflict, both Mrs. Ruth and Grace finally found their own paths. No longer burdened by responsibilities or relying on each other, they began living their own lives, each in their own way. For Mrs. Ruth, freedom didn't just come from not having to worry about her daughter, but also from the ability to rediscover joy and meaning in her personal life. For Grace, freedom came from being able to stand on her own and find inner peace without depending on anyone. Mrs. Ruth no longer felt that she had to sacrifice for her daughter. In the past, she had dedicated herself entirely to worrying about and caring for Grace, sometimes feeling as though she had become a mother who sacrificed too much. While she loved her daughter, the weight of those responsibilities had sometimes worn her out and made her feel as if she had lost control of her own life. Now, she didn't have to worry about Grace anymore, as her daughter had grown and could take care of herself. Mrs. Ruth felt a sense of relief, as if a huge weight had been lifted. No more constant calls from Grace asking for help or tense conversations. Mrs. Ruth now felt the freedom she had regained. Every morning, she woke up and did things she enjoyed, from tending to her little garden to attending yoga classes she hadn't had time for in years. This sense of freedom made her feel as though she was coming back to life, as if the time spent raising her children had become a silent pause for her to rediscover herself. Her volunteer work at the community center also gave her a sense of purpose. No longer just a mother, Mrs. Ruth was now a woman who could contribute to society, help others, and feel joy in every small action. Each time she participated in a project, she felt an indescribable happiness, as if she were reviving the aspirations she had once had in the past. For Grace, the change was just as profound. She had found a stable job and no longer felt insecure or anxious about the steps ahead. Grace no longer looked to her mother as her only support. She realized she could stand on her own and face life without relying on others. Although she still loved her mother, Grace had learned to live independently and make decisions with more confidence. Since deciding to live independently, Grace had changed a lot. She began participating in community activities and building strong social connections. She no longer felt deprived or isolated, but instead felt a sense of belonging and integration within a community. This not only helped her find joy again, but also taught her how to help others without relying on anyone else. The relationship between the two began to become lighter and more comfortable. They still kept in touch, but there was no longer a feeling of rescuing one another. The calls they made were now filled with love and mutual respect. When they talked, they shared what was happening in their lives, but there was no longer a sense of bearing responsibility or burdens for the other person. This change in their relationship made both Mrs. Ruth and Grace feel lighter and happier than ever before. One weekend afternoon, the two sat together in Mrs. Ruth's small garden. The sun was setting, creating a beautiful scene with soft rays of light filtering through the leaves. Grace looked at her mother with gratitude and respect, realizing that, although they had moments of misunderstanding, they had now found a way to love and support each other in a more mature way. Mrs. Ruth also looked at her daughter with affection, no longer burdened by worry or sadness from a sense of absence. Instead, she felt the freedom and happiness in seeing Grace grown and strong. The daughter she had once worried about could now walk her own path. And Mrs. Ruth, the mother, had also found her own life again, with her own joys, passions, and a freedom she couldn't have imagined before. Both mother and daughter had found freedom, and more importantly, they had found happiness in living their own lives, no longer burdened by overwhelming responsibilities or unnecessary weights. This freedom was not about distance, but about mutual respect, the understanding that each person could live their own life while still sharing moments of love and supporting each other when needed.